Hello there, everyone, and welcome back to One Idea Away. As you know, we talk about a range of topics. Everything seems to come back to that sense of how can we have a more connected life. We're regularly revisiting this and seeing this theme pop up. And naturally, you've probably noticed that among that idea of connection, relationships being a very, very important part of that idea of living a more connected life. And so, as we go into that realm, you've probably heard me talk about how this sense of relationship is something that is proving out to be more and more important to so many different aspects of our lives. It's a predictor of our well-being. It's a predictor of our happiness. It's a predictor of our longevity. And relationships, this idea of being in connection, is something that more people seem to be recognizing just how much this really truly matters to them. And it's actually kind of interesting because you may recall from a episode we did quite a while ago with Jonathan Rausch on the happiness curve. We kind of tend to hit a little bit of this dip in our happiness and satisfaction levels in around our midlife. It's the proverbial midlife crisis. Well, at that time, part of what's going on is the shift in values that we have, where it used to be a little bit more on the individuality and making our mark and achievement and those types of things. And our values start to shift towards relationship and being in connection and more socially minded in that regard. And then we see our happiness, start to emerge at a completely different level. So as opposed to this being something that we understand later in life, why don't we start working on this now, since it seems to be so vital to who we are as individuals, but also who we are as society. And I think that's one of the other really interesting things. It's where we're going to begin our conversation today, is how being in relationship is something we probably need now more than ever, probably ever before, it seems, because of the complexity, because of the challenges that we face as a world, as people, as human beings, and all the different challenges we face out there. And it's one thing to work on our relationships at home. It's another to figure out how do those start to translate to the way that we can be in relationship, the ways we can come together and draw more unity and recognize our shared humanity more and more, because that's something that's also proving vital to us. And so with that, I want to be able to have on our show today a very special guest who quite literally, you've heard me use that phrase of, guys, we're wired to connect. She quite literally wrote the book on Wired to Connect, the title being Wired to Connect. And so we get to introduce today Amy Banks. Amy's a psychiatrist, speaker, author, writer, as I mentioned, as well as an educator. And she is dedicated to spreading the scientific knowledge that people need healthy human relationships for emotional as well as physical growth and well-being, as well as promoting a culture of individualism and power over others lead to chronic stress and chronic disease. A little bit of the research I referenced a moment ago. Amy's the first person to bring relational cultural theory together with interpersonal neurobiology and is the foremost expert in this combined field. She has spoken nationally and internationally on the neurobiology of relationship. She's a popular interviewee on the topics of loneliness, friendship, and the neuroscience of relationship, having been quoted in the New York Times, O Magazine, Health Magazine, to name a few. She's got a very popular blog called Wired to Love, which is published online at Psychology Today. And she co-authored the book of Wired to Connect, as well as the author of 4 Ways to Click, How to Rewire Your Brain for Stronger, More Rewarding Relationships. And so with that, Amy, I want to welcome you to One Idea Away.
Thank you, Luke. I'm very, very happy to be here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit on this kind of more macro level, this cultural level of what's going on right now. And I guess just as we start to move there, but before I kind of toss that opening question to you, I think it's important for people to know, if you haven't seen it in the news, there is almost an epidemic level of loneliness that is occurring throughout just all different facets of society right now. And we're seeing it actually even more and more pronounced with younger generations as well. It seems to be proliferating in a whole other way. And so this is one of those factors that we want to talk about today, but it's also contributing to some other things that are going on in the world, which we'll also get to. But to get there, I think, Amy, you've got a very interesting perspective. I know it's something that you've spent some time really kind of giving some thought based on your work in the realm that you come out of, is that we've got this culture of kind of fear and of power that seems to be really, really prevalent. We can see it in the media. We can see it in our politics. We can see it in our global economics. And I'm curious, how is that focus? How is that pervasiveness of fear and the focus on power, something that's actually undermining our well-being, and very much contributing to that epidemic of isolation and loneliness that we face.
Boy,
Big question.
that's yeah, I was going to say that's a big question, but I think it is really at this point in time with the statistics that you're alluding to is really the most important question, right? Because up until this point, we as a society keep thinking, okay, we will um, try to, build individual strategies to fix individuals, right? And we're not looking at the culture. And I think the culture is really, what needs to be changed here. Um, and so if you look at power over cultures, and there's a long history over the last hundred plus years, right? It started actually with this notion back in actually 1928 with Herbert Hoover, who actually first started talking about rugged individualism,
Mhm.
right? And glorified this idea that an American, a true American, a mature American was somebody who could stand on his own 2 feet. They literally talked about, somebody who was entirely self-reliant
Yep.
and not dependent on the government. And I think what you have is, of course, that this has been, kind of bantered uh, back and forth through society through many, many, many decades. And now we arrive at this place where it's almost a caricature of that, right? And what that does when you really, put people out there to fight for their own survival, right? Then, other people are no longer kind of friends or allies or somebody that can support you. They are actually competitors, and I think we have that extreme version of competitiveness in our country now. I always like to say I'm not against competition. I was an athlete, a basketball
Yeah.
player in college, and I love to compete. But what we're competing for is, are you worthy of being in our society, right? Are you of value? So
Mm.
power over dynamics completely stress all of us out because and at some point we might talk about this a little bit more deeply. It's what I get into in my book, which is our entire physiology has developed and evolved through millennium
Yeah.
at this point to function best when we are in packs, when we're in tribes, when we're in healthy connections,
Yeah.
right? And are in the last 20 years we have all of this research about the neuroscience of that and how in fact our brains and our bodies are wired to literally calm us down
Yeah.
when we are accepted, when we're resonating with other people. That healthy relationships, mutual relationships, where people aren't trying to dominate us
Hmm.
or judge us or stratify us, literally allow us, our immune system, I mean, every system in our body to function better.
Yeah.
So if we don't change this culture, right? Because you think about how we get power over other people, really, and you see this again in a caricature now, is the leaders scare people,
Yeah.
right? People, whether they're leading an organization or a country or whatever, they scare people. And when people are scared, their sympathetic nervous system is activated uh, to an extreme. They're chronically stressed. When they're chronically stressed, everything tanks,
Yeah.
right? People get sicker, they die sooner. I mean, it is a death spiral, quite literally, where we are culturally.
Yeah. It's interesting because there's several different kind of ways we can branch off here, but
Yeah.
what part of where you just ended, which I think is so critical, that's also becoming something we're more aware of or more sensitive to because of the research that is just kind of pouring out over the last decade or two around our nervous systems and how much our nervous systems and the way that they are conditioned dramatically impact the way that we're making decisions, the way that we're trying to connect with others. And that right now, with a lot of fear and scarcity that is being portrayed out there, a lot of the power over dynamics that you describe,
Mhm.
the overstimulation that we have of just information and situations coming at us from every direction,
Yep.
our nervous systems are just completely on overdrive. And that's going to have a deteriorating type of an effect, which we're seeing. I mean, we know the healthcare numbers are as bad as some of the other numbers that come out right now.
Exactly.
And I think what I think I do want to pour a little further into is this idea of the cultural shift that we may want to take a look at. And then let's understand the science behind some of this, because also what you described is that rugged individualism that Hoover had brought up, is that we know that there's kind of this great man theory, this rugged independence as well, that seems to be prevalent in a lot of Western society, and that's actually in ways moving us away from so much of what most supports us.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is also just this myth of the self-made man, which really, when you hear the stories behind a lot of these extraordinary human beings and what they've done, there's a whole lot more there than it's just simply not being given credit for.
Absolutely right. No, I think your point is well taken, right? Is when you build a society that is based on the self-made man, then there is an active investment
Yeah.
in creating mythology that supports that,
Mm,
that supports it,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And just as you're saying, when you scratch the surface, and it doesn't need to be deep, there are no self-made men or women for that matter,
Yeah.
right? I mean, they all have networks behind them. And in fact, people that are truly isolated die, right? I mean, I always like to say, so in our penal system, we have solitary confinement as the worst punishment.
Yeah.
Yet we have a culture that says, really, you should be able to operate autonomously
Yeah.
without help, without, kind of relying on somebody to have an ear, to have a hug, to have whatever, right?
Yeah.
So, and we don't seem to um, think a lot about the contradictions in the messages that get put forth,
Yeah.
right? About how we manipulate relationship
Yeah.
actually to penalize people,
Yeah. So
you
what are
know?
what are some of the let's think about that. So when we talk about some of the ways that we're kind of perpetuating that myth,
Yeah.
some of the ways that relationship is being manipulated, or some of the images are being manipulated, what are kind of some of those, what you would say are some of those kind of chief patterns or chief beliefs that you're seeing inside of culture that are having us move towards individualism and that side of things, as opposed to a potentially very different center of the dartboard?
Well, for instance, I mean, I think you can take it right from the get-go, and we could go stage by stage developmentally,
Mm,
right? uh, I happen to have two kids that shockingly have made it to 21. Okay, so they're now adults, but there is a whole body of literature around what does it mean to Ferberize a baby, right?
yeah.
Which is essentially to say, okay, this child that does not have the neural wiring yet to have any kind of self-regulation,
Yeah.
you're going to put them alone in a room and increasingly let them cry it out,
Yeah.
right? And so, through the lens of developing autonomous people, right? People that can, the myth is that that baby who eventually stops crying is somehow content, as opposed to another way of looking at it, which is that that baby is now in a state of learned helplessness,
Yeah.
right? They stop crying because they know nobody's going to be there.
Yeah.
And you compare that with a connected version of parenting where you have the family bed, which of course is common all over the world.
Hmm.
We happen to be in an environment where we're rich enough to afford separate bedrooms and
Right.
separate beds,
Yeah.
right? um, but part of the family bed is not simply sharing the bed, it's the physical contact. So literally our regulatory pathways in our nervous system to help us settle down when we're stressed or anxious are built in those rich connections early on: the hugging, the
Hmm.
cuddling, the soft voices, all of that. It literally forms the pathways for dopamine, for serotonin,
Hmm.
for the endogenous opioids, for all of the hormones and chemicals and neuropeptides in our bodies that are eventually going to allow us to weather the
Hmm.
stressors of life,
Hmm.
right? So when you've been Ferberized, which, and I think Ferber himself actually has gone back on his idea that this is a good idea.
Yeah.
When you start your life like that, you start learning, okay, people aren't going to respond to me,
Yeah.
right? When I'm in that level of distress, and I can't calm myself down. I don't have anything to calm myself down, right? Except a bottle or a pacifier. You move on into kindergarten, and I won't go through all the way
Mhm.
to adulthood, but so then you go into the American school systems, right? Which are hyper competitive.
Yeah.
everywhere, even in the worst schools. They're hyper competitive. They're focused on, the reading, writing, arithmetic, which I don't have anything against.
Yeah.
But what if in those early years, what was as important as learning about your body and learning about the importance of relationship and how it can help calm you down and how to treat a friend and how to listen, right? When you're in a power over system that says, it literally part of it is, I'm not worried about my impact on you.
Mm.
I have more power. I don't have to worry about my impact on you. I don't have to listen
Yeah.
attentively, right? Anybody who has been in a subordinate position knows that's their role,
Yeah.
to pay attention to the people in power, right? So we seem to want to create children in our schools that will be able to be spit out on the other end and compete in this capitalistic, hyper competitive survival of the fittest environment,
Yeah.
right? And that is directly antagonistic to building the pathways that we need to be able to reach out to people, soothe other people,
Mhm.
listen, comfort. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And literally the concept of codependency is one of my, as you can imagine, things that just drives me crazy, right? Because it's so pathologized, right? You're one of those people that needs people too much. It's like everybody needs people
Yeah.
too much. If you want to tell me that codependency is where there isn't, you build relationships where there's no mutuality, then I will say yes, that's a problem,
Yep.
right? Where there's not an even give and take in the relationship, that's a problem.
Yeah.
But don't just label turning to others as codependency.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, I mean, even just in that sense, I mean, we're talking about that idea of healthy interdependence, because we do have this connectivity with other people. There's no other way around it, and it's
Yeah,
differentiating between healthy and unhealthy. And we've just labeled the unhealthy form of it codependence, which just whitewashes the whole kind of
that's right.
conversation that you're talking about. I think the other thing that you brought up, and was wondering for any further thoughts on this, is that when you describe early schooling and what you're
Mhm.
describing of that idea of listening and what does it mean to be a good friend, we're talking about the development of social emotional learning, of social emotional development, right? And
That's right.
the reason why I'm bringing this up specifically is that because I can hear, right, you can hear the objections to some of this, right, based on the mythology and the culture of, but wait a minute, if we're soothing them too long and we're focused just
Mhm.
on those things and their feelings, we're going to lose progress. We're not going to be as driven. We're not going to be as motivated. And in all honesty,
Yeah.
a lot of the research around things like social emotional learning, social emotional intelligence, they actually are greater predictors of so-called material success than
Yeah.
even just the general way we've been doing things.
I know. And that is the irony.
Yeah.
I always ask myself, why is it that people aren't listening to that? Now, I
Yeah.
think they're not, right? Because almost we don't have the receptor sites. It
Mm.
you in every um almost everything we take in media, in literature, and in this country is devoted to the mythology of
Yeah.
separate self.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like, that will be an interesting concept, and then it just diffuses out, right? Because it's got no place to land. All of our institutions and our organizations and our structures are built in this power over model,
Yeah.
right? So, and you're absolutely right. And it's predictive that if we teach kids how to cooperate, they are going to be more effective players in cooperative environments.
Yeah.
All work is cooperative, right?
Yeah.
This idea that the only way to get at it is to pit people against each other is just, again, it's just propaganda.
Yeah.
And so if we start teaching kids early on about, we'll get into this I'm sure at some point,
Mhm.
about the smart vagus nerve and about what making facial contact and smiling and speaking with another person in a certain tone and listening intently, if we tell that child, if we teach that child that they have a pathway, that literally when they do that and they feel safe, that there's a message that's sent to their stress response system that says you can settle down,
Yeah.
that is a huge impact for these kids that are at school feeling stressed,
Yeah.
right? Getting this message, do homework in third grade, do you have your math done, do you have, and again, what do? We pit one against the other as if there isn't room in the school day to work on relationships and these other, intellectual skills,
Yeah,
right? And
absolutely.
so you have, advanced intellectual skills, maybe, although, I think the US is lacking in that as well,
Yeah.
but at the expense of immature amygdalas or
Yeah.
affect centers, right?
Hmm.
And not being able to know themselves and know other people really in a way that is, that serves them well.
Well, it's again along those lines, which I think is really interesting, and again, research bearing this out that when we are in greater connection, when we have more empathy and compassion, when we're
Mhm.
connected to the so-called softer side, the relational side of who we are, it does obviously therefore quiet our autonomic nervous system. It quiets a lot of the stress and those types of responses. And of course, what's happening is that we actually get more blood flow into the brain. We actually get more creativity that's going on. We can solve problems in, more advanced ways because we've got more perspective that's coming in and we're more open to the different ways that it could be solved. And it's just
Yeah.
kind of really right. It's really interesting that uh, this is kind of the way forward. And anyway, the reason why part of what I bring up is because I think it's this one last piece of the there's many other pieces within this
Yeah.
this cultural side of things, but one more piece that occurred to me is that part of that competition that
Mhm.
keeps us divided is based on this belief of zero sum. There will
Yes.
only
Yes.
ever be enough resources, enough jobs, enough power, enough this, enough that. And it's only the few that get to that point, as
Yeah.
opposed to, well, we've creatively expanded ourselves as a species for all of these different years. This earth up until maybe the last century has been more than abundant in all the things it can provide to us. How is it that we can actually start to look at things differently so that
Yeah.
we're not competing for something we believe is lacking, but instead creating something that can be abundant to take care
Exactly,
of?
exactly. No, I love that. That's the pivot point, right?
Yeah.
That's the pivot point of being able to not get stuck in this, as you say, zero sum game where actually everybody loses. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the irony, right?
Yeah.
Everybody loses. I mean,
Hmm.
even the people that are at the top of the heap are losing now.
Hmm.
Everybody's losing,
Yeah.
right? Into something that really is more sustainable,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
Individually and societally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the piece, I've used this phrase of we're wired to connect as
Yeah.
individuals, as a species, over and over again. But I do want to turn to that side of this conversation because I found it so amazing. Just I mean, literal ways that we're wired. Our neurobiology, our brains are wired for us to connect in a specific way. So I want to have a little of that conversation because you break it down in such a way that it's we can actually understand
Yeah.
which may be the pathways that are holding us back versus the ones that are helping us
Right.
thrive and how to work with that, which
Yeah.
that framework I thought was just it was magnificent, and it's
Yeah. It's great.
also relatively simple once
Exactly.
you get it laid out.
That's right. I like to say this. It's not brain science. It's
Yeah.
but it is brain science. I mean, and you're absolutely right. I mean, these are known entities at this point,
Yeah.
and they are, and because we know that the brain is malleable, and by the brain, I want to be clear that anybody listening knows that I'm talking about not just this thing that's in our squash, but that it's the central nervous system that innervates everything, all of our glands are, it's a very integrated system into the whole of us, right? So because I think there's a risk of rarefying then the
Yeah.
human brain over all other organs, and I think that doesn't make sense either. However, what we do know, so some of the things we do know, I mean, I referenced the smart vagus nerve, right?
Mhm.
um, the other thing that we do know that I think plays out in this society in a huge way is, there's something called the social pain overlap theory, and it came from a set of researchers who
Yeah.
looked at why it hurts to be left out.
Mhm.
And what they found was that, the area of the brain that gets activated when we are socially excluded, and they set up a little, laboratory experiment with imaging that I won't describe here
Mhm.
because we don't have enough time, but essentially that when we're left out, when we're socially rejected, the area of our brain that is activated, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, is the exact same area of the brain that's activated when we are in physical pain, right? So again, it's an alarm system that registers the distress of pain. And because we're uh, connected human beings and our our life depends on being in social interaction. If we're excluded, an alarm goes off, and that
Yeah.
alarm is connected to our sympathetic nervous system. It stresses us out,
Yeah.
and it should, right? So pain is pain. And a particularly toxic thing that happens in power over um, societies and cultures is that we don't learn how to bridge difference. Difference,
Mm.
we maximize. We know difference um, stimulates a little bit of curiosity
Yeah.
and maybe even fear in the child, more curiosity. But if the child knows that this thing that's different is okay for the parents,
Yeah.
goes away. That's fine, right? That's all they need. But in a society that's so focused on competitiveness, we don't see difference as curious. We see it as competition
Yeah.
and threatening, and we immediately sort of see a difference in somebody else. We judge it and we stratify it,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Either they're better than me or they're worse than me. And in each one of those stratifications that happen every single day, minute to minute, you get a hit of pain,
Yeah.
right? It causes pain. And so we have this entire system built out that is causing us all to be in pain. And I always, I'm reading right now a book called Dope Sick. It's all about the opioid epidemic. And
Hmm.
I think it's no surprise that we live in a culture that both generates enormous amounts of loneliness and social pain. And we have a stunning opioid
Yeah.
addiction,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Killing us.
It was amazing because as you walk through the care model, so for everybody, the acronym that is presented in four, I'm sorry, it was four ways to click, is care, and that's calm, accepted, resonance, and energetic. And so we're talking about kind of this process of four major neural pathways that really are the ways in which we primarily connect. And I found the reason I just want to give everybody
Yeah.
the frame, but the part that you're speaking about with the opioids and how this issue of addiction, and there's many different forms of addiction, not only substance, that tie into our reward system, our dopamine centers. And I
Yeah.
thought this was also really interesting because what I see in this, and I'm just kind of curious where your head goes with this. What I've seen in this is that we, as you say, when we're not getting that reward, that dopamine from certain types of connection with our life, which we are wired for that connection and to get that reward. But when we turn away from it and instead look to other things to get that dopamine hit, it actually is also not only potentially unhealthy, it's moving us even further away from each other. And these very devices that we all walk
Yeah.
around with are engineered to trigger that dopamine inside of our brains. And
Yeah.
quite literally, the things that connect us all are the very things that are disconnecting us from one another.
Right. Right. No, couldn't agree more. The dopamine reward system, which everybody, I think most people do kind of associate with the addictions of all
Yeah.
kinds, right? Never gets taught. Again, this is one of these things in kindergarten. I would be teaching people or preschool, which is healthy relationships give you a hit of
Yeah.
this chemical that leads to more energy, more motivation, mood regulation.
Yeah.
And those are things that everybody needs.
Yeah.
And if you don't have it from relationships, you will seek it elsewhere because it is a primary neurotransmitter that you need to continue to take one step forward, right? And so people turn to other things, right?
Mhm.
Drugs, I mean, opioids. But think about it, the culture is also perfectly tuned into this because we have capitalism and
Yeah.
consumerism, right?
Mhm.
And so you can go and buy something and get a little mini hit of dopamine. So it kind of props up that whole system,
Absolutely.
and it's tied into our whole gross national product.
Yeah.
How, when, where, and why we're getting our dopamine hits,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So it's a particularly insidious problem that we're trying to dismantle
Yeah.
here. And when you start trying to think, you know, let's get your dopamine reconnected to healthy relationships. And that is one of the things I emphasize, certainly in the care program,
Yeah.
trying to help people identify, the goal of it was to help people, number one, really get a good snapshot of the ways that relationships in their lives are shaping them,
Hmm.
right? But also to get a snapshot of how their own pathways have developed, where they stand at this moment, and how they might be impacting your relationships. If you've been somebody that was raised in a hyper, kind of abusive relationship, you are going to be sympathetic nervous system dominated.
Yeah.
You're going to be afraid, you're going to be less likely to connect. Without the connection, you're going to go to other things to try to get dopamine, right?
Mhm.
You're going to be less able to read people, that resonance that we get from pathways where we read other people's energies, their intentions, their actions, the feelings. We read that by mimicking it internally. I mean, there's a concreteness about that, about the science
Yeah.
of what goes on inside of us around relationships, that so blows apart the mythology of the separate self,
Yeah.
right? And that
Absolutely.
needs to be just like bannered, right?
And I think that's, what's amazing. And I found that part of, again, part of the way I would summarize some of this work in terms of benefit for people is, even before we get to the stage of greater connection and relationship, even though that's a major gear of what we're after here, is that when we understand the kind of the neurobiology that's at work, and we
Mhm.
understand the way that it works, we can then be more attentive, more mindful of what are the ways in which we are connected that is either out of stress or fear, or is connected in an unhealthy manner,
Yep.
versus when these pathways are functioning in their intended and healthy state, we're
Right.
seeing and picking up on what's going on in our environment, and specifically with other people, in a much more accurate way.
Right.
And right, so we can see more clearly, we can relate more clearly, which
Yep.
means we're going to have more confidence. We're not going to be as prone to fear. But I think it also means that, and just to be clear with everybody, this is not just the lovey-dovey of how do we feel, more in connection with each other, because it's
Mhm.
it's truly about being able to perceive accurately, objectively. So if there is a harm or a threat, you can deal with that in a healthy fashion, as opposed
Exactly.
to all of the wonderful relationships and connections in our life that we deal with in an unhealthy way.
Right, right. And really, really, I mean, when you ask a person to break down in the ways that the care assessment does,
Yes.
the relationships, I mean, people always have kind of these aha moments, which is, my gosh, I'm spending this much time
Yeah.
in this particular relationship, and look at the qualities that are lacking.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And not even, they might not know it. They might know that, I have a little discomfort in this relationship, or sometimes I don't want to see this person, or whatever. But to really break it down and to see what the quality of those relationships are, and to concretely begin to think, okay, given that
Mhm.
and what I bring to relationships, what do I need to work on
Yeah.
to be able to be a better friend, to be able to listen better, to be able to speak my truth, to be able to, and like you said, this isn't all about lovey dovey, everybody being nice to each
Yeah.
other. You have to have these pathways for connection are absolutely essential to be able to even be in healthy conflict, right? I mean,
Yes.
conflict in relationship is a place of great growth,
Hmm.
right? And in order to have that, you have to have a pretty well modulated autonomic nervous system,
Yeah.
right? You can't be spouting off your sympathetic nervous system all the time,
Hmm.
fighting, fleeing, freezing from parasympathetic. It just doesn't work. And so being able to stay somewhat steady
Yeah.
in a conflicted conversation is, one of the most important aspects of moving a relationship along,
Well,
right?
I think that highlights this idea of, when some of these associations, some of these pathways are not functioning in their most optimal or healthy state, you get into an area of conflict. And what happens? I don't know, maybe you have hyperpartisanship, meaning that everybody retreats to their mutual camp,
You got it.
because we
Yep.
can't we can't sit in the tension in a healthy manner of two
That's
or three disparate ideas that don't seem to jive together, as
right.
opposed to when you look at the individuals who are the most innovative in the world, they had
Yes.
the ability to hold two or three or four completely competing priorities and ideas in their head, and just keep working it through.
That's right.
And
That's
that's part of what you're talking about. So it's very practical in the sense that if we can optimize what, this incredible machine that we've got running throughout our bodies,
yep.
it gives us a completely different way of relating, for the sake of creating better progress, and not running away or retreating into our camps and retreating in a tribal fashion, even when we're in
Exactly.
conflict with one another.
Yep, that's exactly. I mean, very, very well said.
So I think,
Very well said.
and one of the other things, so I wanted to connect with this too, because uh, in the book, and again, four ways to click, you present just this wonderful and again, straightforward, very simple assessment for us to understand kind of where our wiring is at. And you ultimately relate it to, and the first time I'd ever heard of this, I think was Jim Rohn, out of the personal development world would tell you, you are the sum of the 5 people that you spend the most time with. And I mean, right there in the assessment, you're kind of building off of that
Right.
framework. But when you walk through those 5 relationships that you invest the most time in, and that could be, as you said, face time, it could be mental time, but those 5 relationships that are most important to us all in that
Yep.
regard, and walk through in an objective manner to see and qualify the characteristics of that relationship,
Yep.
it has you see things, even people that may be very close and you may be in wonderful love with and everything else, you may still begin to find, there are some other patterns there. And this doesn't say there's a challenge with that person. It's to,
Yeah.
reflectively mirroring, okay,
Right.
what's going on in here? And
Yeah.
again, you point it back to specific, very specific areas that we can work on.
Right. Right. Exactly. Exactly. To have something that kind of helps you make sense of your relational world
Mm,
and your inner world, kind of that, you know, intero extero kind of world, and that you feel like you can leverage, right? I mean, the goal is always to harness the power of relationship because it is profound,
yeah.
right? And it should be fueling everything in our lives,
Hmm.
right? I mean, that's really the basis of humanity. That's how we literally evolved as a species.
Yeah.
And to be able to, you know, use that in some way to make yourself and the world better, right? That
Hmm.
it's not a zero sum.
Hmm.
This is a win-win,
Hmm.
right? And get other people engaged, and that this is stuff that you can learn. And even, I work in the field of trauma, so I have
Yeah.
people all the time like, can this be fixed? Absolutely,
Yeah.
it can be fixed. You can change the way you are in your relationships. You can help facilitate change of those relationships,
Hmm.
with different engagement. I mean, it's a very positive thing in a world that's increasingly negative and dark,
Yeah.
right?
So I wanted to go a little further than into the specifics of the care model. The first one being calm, and I think we
Yeah.
talked a little bit about this. It's connected to the strong Vegas and how it is that there are
Smart
certain.
Vegas.
Say
Right.
again.
Yeah. Smart Vegas.
Smart Vegas. And when we're connected in that manner and we're using it, and we're building that smart Vegas, we're going to come at things from a much more balanced, centered type of state, which means we're going to be more accurate in those perceptions. We've talked a little bit about that. I
Yeah.
think the next one is one of the areas I would love to hear you talk a little more on because it's accepted. And
Yeah.
this is one of those areas, right, where as soon as I saw the word, I'm like, wait a minute, how do we work on the feeling of acceptance? Like, doesn't that involve other people? Don't we have to be, isn't that on them, not necessarily on us? And the way
Yeah.
that you connect it and what you connect it back to in terms of what's going on in here, I think
Yeah.
is really important for everybody to understand.
Yeah, so it gets back to that, the pathway, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex alarm system that we now know activates when we're socially excluded, when we're not accepted, right? It is going to activate, and it doesn't even, the strange thing is it doesn't even matter if you care if the person doesn't accept you.
Mhm.
Okay, you know what I mean? Like if you
Yeah.
cognitively don't care or don't like that person, and in the study, of course, it's little doughboy men on a
Yeah.
computer screen.
Yeah.
And even with that, I mean, that's how primal this is, that we want to be accepted, that we
Yeah.
need to be in our tribe or in our group, right? And if we, so, but it is so easy to see how that is being manipulated right now
Yeah.
around
Yeah.
difference. I mean, what I had spoken to earlier about stratifying difference is a part of this,
Hmm.
but it goes into, this is what's being activated with um, racism,
Hmm. Hmm.
sexism, any of the isms that are so prevalent,
Hmm.
right? You know, that those kinds of human interactions, we have to be thinking about this when we're trying to have the discussion about why do police officers, often white police officers, shoot black men in the back,
Hmm.
right? that they really have gotten, they're that reactive,
Yeah.
you know, or, you know, I mean, it infuses our entire culture, right? It's happening now with, you know, this debate around people that are immigrants trying to come into our country,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So imagine the level of acceptance that is not there for these kids in the, you know, in these detention centers,
Yeah.
apart from their parents,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you can't look at this stuff without realizing how incredibly toxic the divides are.
You see it in, you know, it's a
Bringing,
on any different angle. You see even within politics
yeah,
where it's this group over here is leaving you out, and
yeah,
therefore we should do this. And so
okay,
it's that constant pinning of being against the other because the
yeah,
other has left you out in this
right,
way. And it's a leverage point, a manipulation point that's being used in many different forms actually inside of politics.
absolutely.
What do we like if you know we're at home, where do we begin this conversation, meaning where do we begin to work on recognizing that there's a part of our brain that is actually the alarm system that might be going off in ways that it maybe isn't serving us?
Yeah, it's a great question, and in fact, in another week, I'm going out to Chicago to do a workshop at a conference on bridging the Great Divide.
Mm,
How do you break? You know, what does neuroscience tell us about trying to, you know, bridge these divides so that we can actually have conversations? And what the way that I'm breaking it down is a couple of different ways. But the first is primarily that a very simple one, which is my mentor Jean Baker Miller used to talk about when you're in relationships, the most effective form of communication, verbal communication, is when you can communicate with feeling thoughts, she called them.
mm,
And that meant, if you think about it, feeling thoughts. So it's not just the hypercognitive understanding,
yeah.
and it's not just the emotion. It's being able to integrate the two to sort of both say what is going on for you, but
Hmm.
also to you know, really transmit some of the affect and emotion with it,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And so what I've begun to really think about and talk about is what is your relational sweet spot, okay? And that is the place at which you can hold on to both, right? Both the cognitive and the affective.
Yeah.
And that's a very individualized measure, if you will, right?
Mhm.
If you're somebody that has grown up in abuse, you may be one of those people, or have been, you know, or maybe have been, you know, somebody that's been a victim of racism over and over and over
Mhm.
again, or what have you. You may have less of a tolerance, right? You might flip that switch,
Yeah.
right? So that there way too much emotion is coming out, and all of a sudden you're blasting the person that you're trying to have a conversation with. Or the other thing that you could do is you might move completely out of any kind of emotionally engaged connection and
Yeah.
think, okay, I'm just going to have an intellectual
Yeah.
conversation and try to understand it. And neither one of those strategies actually get you very far,
Hmm.
right? They induce reactivity and disconnection in the other person.
Hmm.
So trying to do an individual assessment of what are the things that overwhelm me, right? And in this group, it happens to be a group of relational cultural theory practitioners I'm going to be speaking to, but we're going to be doing some visuals, like what does, you know, okay, this is an image of a stream in nature. This is an image of, for instance, Donald Trump in one of his sneers. This is an image of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, blah blah blah. And begin to
What's your name?
embody that. What does your body feel like when you see these things, right?
Mhm.
And so the other thing that is part of the care program is something called building a library of positive relational moments,
Yeah.
right? And so what you want to do, and so yes, you want to know at what level of reactivity do you live in the world. You know, if you've had horrible trauma, and you want to try to now have a conversation with, for instance, a Trump supporter who seems to really downplay Me Too, sexual harassment, sexual abuse, all of that kind of stuff, you know, that may be way too big a divide for you to start with
Right.
right now,
Right.
right? You know what I mean? So trying to pick a few early conversations with less difference and practice
Yeah.
and be aware, practice with your best friends on a point of conflict. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
To try to break it down, break it down, break it down so that you're not so overwhelmed
Yeah.
that you can't manage it. But building that, like literally thinking of three, if not more, embodied relational moments that were truly mutual, truly connecting. And I do this exercise with people where I say, okay, for 1 minute, I want you to just close your eyes and embody a positive relational moment. And what's
Yeah.
fascinating is you can literally, when people come back into the group, they will describe feeling these different pathways coming back online, right?
Mm.
They can feel themselves smiling. The
Hmm.
smart vagus comes on, an opening in their chest, right?
Hmm.
Kind of an opening, a calmness, some joy,
Yeah.
simply by visualizing, right?
Yeah.
By embodying a relational moment. Those have to be with you when you have these difficult conversations,
Yes.
right?
Well, it's interesting
Because
because we're
yeah,
picking up with also on that is this idea that number one, us spending the time. I mean, this has been conducted research in other areas that a part of our brain tends to hold on to certain negative information for survival
yep,
purposes more so than positive. And
yep,
part of what you're describing is a way of us spending more intentional time with that which is positively contributed to the way in which we experience life. And so those
exactly.
positive relational moments are a point of anchoring and embodying. The other piece,
Yep,
though, that even opens up to me is the idea of being in one of those positive relational moments and experiences and picturing even times that with those relationships, we've had to navigate through challenge
yep,
and still holding that space as well and
yep,
recognizing, oh,
yep,
wait a minute, we've done this. We did it really
yep,
successfully and actually felt really good too.
yep,
And so you can build on that as
yep,
this process and this toolkit. And it's something else that I saw highlight. You mentioned it a moment ago. Is in those embodied feelings, the more that we also take the time to recognize emotionally what's going on for ourselves and physically how we're feeling those emotions, attunes us more to ourselves. It attunes us more to what's going on in others. And so I,
absolutely.
I I share this because there's one other piece that I wanted to add because it just gives an example to what's going on here, especially
Yep,
around that point of acceptance. Was one of the other areas is that when we don't feel accepted, we tend to withdraw or hold back aspects of ourselves. And you describe that. It's sometimes it can come off either too emotional or too intellectual or not enough emotion, not enough of the cognitive side.
yep,
And that, I mean, I'll tell you that personally, it absolutely described me. I was much
yep,
more on the intellectual pursuit as opposed to
yep,
the emotional because it was safer. That was my way of operating in the world.
you got it.
And
Right.
would always reiterate, I don't feel as understood. I don't feel as heard. I don't feel as connected. All all those. And it
Yeah,
was only when step at a time, as you described, that I started incorporating this back in a very intentional way that things opened up for me and my
yeah,
experience of life fundamentally changed.
yeah,
So all of these pieces are truly connected
yeah,
and they build off of one another, even though there's individual focal points within
yeah,
these pathways.
right.
And if we begin with ourselves, we begin with our key relationships, and then we begin to expand outward. To me, that sounds like that's part of where the greater cultural change is ultimately going to come from, because we can't start with the kind of the amorphous system, as it were, because at the
Yeah,
end of the day, the system is made up of us. It's made up of
you
people.
got it. You got it. Right. Right. Exactly.
Let me just
To change minds.
say
Yeah.
again.
I said we have to change minds, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean,
Right.
literally.
And so, Amy, I guess maybe along those lines to bring us, kind of round full circle today. I guess I'm just kind of curious, just from you, if I give you your kind of 2 to 3 minutes of a soapbox,
Yeah.
what's your hope for this work? What's your hope
I
for the
hope,
impact that this is going to make?
yeah. So my hope for this work is that we really have a cultural revolution. I don't mean that in a grandiose way. I
Mhm.
mean that I mean really changing the culture one relationship at a time. And I think that what I've been very heartened by, I have to say, is that even in the face of and I think probably because the pendulum has swung so far the other way in popular
Yeah.
culture to this disconnected separate self stuff. I think more people are seeing the toxicity of it. Not
Yeah.
everybody,
Mhm.
right? I mean, we still have to have the conversations. But that what I'm seeing is there are more and more groups that are out there that are taking on the hard work of building relationships,
Yeah.
right? And so my hope, and this is, none of us can do it alone, but here you're doing your piece, right? You have your podcast and you're bringing people in to think about how to be connected differently. That's your piece. My piece is working with our new International Center for Growth and Connection, and going out and giving talks and writing books and what have you. There are what I am really excited about is harvesting all of these like-minded groups into like this massive lifeboat of relationality, because any one of us can't do all of the work, but together, right, there will be a tipping point. And there are so many fantastic organizations. I don't know if
Mhm.
you know Tracy Rubel's work. She does Sidewalk Talk, and she
Yes.
literally, yeah, her stuff on
Yes.
Sidewalk Talk. I mean, how fabulous, right? She's not doing exactly what I'm doing,
Yep.
but they're intermingling, right, in this way that is just amplifying the message of relationship
Yeah.
and the importance of relationship. I talked a few weeks ago with the past Surgeon General of the United States, who's now writing a book on loneliness
Mm.
and really putting that out into the
Yeah.
forefront. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So we have to just keep talking, echoing, and amplifying each other's voices,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I'll come away from this and I'll be like, okay, everybody, check out Luke. One Idea Away. This is fantastic. He's doing fantastic stuff. And get it out there, because each one of us can't do it alone, but together we really can shift this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's been also, I would echo, reassuring to see some of the initiatives and projects that are emerging, so many of them also based off of the science and the research and the narrative that's coming from that field, that's showing us ways of moving this forward in very practical and very evidence-based ways. We're seeing all sorts of new projects, Sidewalk Talk being just that great example of one of few that I've seen very recently
Yep.
emerging. And I think I'm also hopeful in kind of going back for a moment to what I began our conversation with around this idea of the happiness curve, is that we
Yep.
get to a point in our lives, and maybe this is us, speaking as a species, where
Right.
we recognize that the way that we've pursued things is beginning to break down, and it's not bringing us the happiness, the satisfaction, the joy that we thought that it would. And it brings us into a time that we need to reconsider.
Yeah.
I do believe that while there is all of the strife and challenge and turmoil that's going on out there right now, which is very truly urgent and important in what we deal with, I also think it's a time that is sort of deconstructing what's going on so that we can allow something new to emerge. And I
You
would,
got it.
right. And so I,
Yep.
I'm very hopeful along with you because of the time that we're in.
Yeah, I
It,
am too. And it's hard to say given these days, but
yeah.
yeah, there is real hope.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, Amy, I want to thank you for stopping in on One Idea Away. I want to thank you for this work that you're doing and just how accessible that you're making this, because this makes a very real difference in our daily lives as well as our collective lives.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I'm happy to be in the lifeboat with you.
Excellent. Thank you, Amy. For everybody, I think just a couple of things I'd leave you with. Certainly check out Amy's work, Amy Banks, and Four Ways to Click, Wired to Connect. There's so much wonderful information there, and it's practical. Like, so it's not just the research side of it, but there are ways of applying this so we can very specifically bring this into our lives. And that's going to, first and foremost, work for you. I know that there's a lot of parents that follow this show. This is going to keep you very mindful in the way that you parent and the way that comes in. And it's also even going to give you a way of changing some of those relationships that may be a bit more challenging for you. And just think about what that will do for your quality of life, and the way that you feel, and the stress levels might, just tick down a couple notches. I think the other thing, though, that I'm also going to encourage you to do is at that cultural level, when you see things going on in the news, when you see things going on in politics, the more that you're aware of these types of things that are actually running inside of our neurobiology and psychology, you can deconstruct what's going on. Meaning, it's like seeing the steps of a magic trick so that you don't get caught up in the illusion. And that's what I would encourage you to do, because at a societal level, I think we also need that just as much as anything. And the best way to do that is to be aware. So I want to thank you once again for tuning in to One Idea Away. Thanks for being in the lifeboat with Amy and myself. And as always, continue to enjoy the journey. Check out IPEC's coach training program at ipeccoaching.com/OIA. And of course, to find out about all the conversations, events, gatherings, all the things that we've got upcoming, then head on over to oneideaaway.com/community. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have, please do us the favor of subscribing, reviewing the show, as well as sharing insights or comments that stood out for you in this episode.